Good evening. This is News.PH. I'm Pia Hontiveros. The journey began long before the papal flight from Rome to Colombo. It began in Manila where, until the very last minute, we weren't sure if Philippine journalists would be on board the papal flight. But when it was confirmed that there would be 14 Filipino journalists who would join the Vatican Accredited Media Personnel, or VAMP, and that I would be VAMP journalist number 46, then the reality dawned on everyone. What was it going to be like to cover the Pope? What was it going to be like to be always playing catch-up with a globe-trotting, jet-setting pontiff who likes to keep promises, who likes to go off somewhere without any media coverage, whose killer of a schedule would only mean we would have to live by it too? Air travel does many things for you. It gives you perspective. A camera on the plane lets you see what you're flying over. When crossing date lines, air travel lets you literally travel back in time, or in a sense get the extra hours in a day we all wish we had. And the drone of the engines through the long hours in flight gets you thinking about everything that happened in the past year that prepared you for the journey. This was not just a story or a coverage, it was more than that. When we got to Rome, my first thought was to do my first report right away at St. Peter's Square. But when we got there, it was drizzling and it would be difficult. So I did the next best thing. Soak in the atmosphere and live and breathe it. I was finally in the Vatican. I could not believe my good fortune. I took photographs even if we all know our minds and hearts can take better photos than a smartphone ever can. But the photos capture exactly how I felt about that one brief, shining moment. It took me my whole life to get here, I said on Twitter, but I'm here. St. Peter's Square glows on this chilly January morning, but I'm sure there's nothing in the Vatican that you haven't already seen, either with your own eyes or on television or in photographs. But for this first-timer here in the Vatican and on the papal flights to accompany Pope Francis when he visits Sri Lanka and my home country, the Philippines, a wave of emotions, a sense of being a pilgrim has engulfed me. Overwhelmed? Beyond that. Because covering the Pope is not just a story, it is a gift and a grace, not so much an opportunity as it is a blessing, not just a coverage as it is a pilgrimage, as a Filipino, as a journalist, as a Catholic. Many of us were baptized Catholic, grew up Catholic, went to Catholic schools run by, say, Benedictine nuns and Jesuit priests, went to Sunday Mass, Mass on holy days of obligation, Holy Week, Christmas, New Year. There are 13 of us Filipino journalists who will be on board the papal flights. From here in Rome, we fly with the Pope to Colombo on the 12th. Sri Lanka has a small Catholic population and brewing political trouble, but the Pope is still going, last we heard. Then we fly with him to Manila on the 15th. In our lifetime, we've known 5 popes: Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis. But Francis's visit is unique. We know that the Philippines is the biggest Catholic country in Asia, but Filipinos around the world are the reasons why parish churches are alive. John Allen Jr., a leading Vatican journalist, told me in an interview I did with him last year that Filipinos are the new Irish who help spread the gospel. Pope Francis will also bring his message of mercy and compassion and the underlying message of a simpler, renewed church. A church devoid of the trappings of this world, a church that is like a field hospital in the middle of a battlefield, one that goes outside the sacristy. A church that, like the Good Shepherd, leaves the 99 sheep to look for the one that is lost and must be carried home. Where this journey takes this pilgrim, only God really knows. A journey that is almost like a prayer sent up to the heavens, like the prayers and songs one grew up with. Pananagutan, walang sinuman ang nabubuhay para sa sarili lamang. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace, or in omnibus, amare et servire Domino. In everything, love and serve the Lord. It is this message that Francis will bring with him as he journeys to the Philippines next week. He is as much a pilgrim as all of us on that flight, or all of you who wait for him in Manila and Tacloban. All our hearts are full as we wait for the Vicar of Christ to pay us a visit, in the same way that one's heart is full as one stands in the heart of Roman Catholicism. One waits so long for something that one thinks it will never come, and then it does. Think of something that you wanted for far too long, how you yearn for it, and then it is given you. The waiting then becomes most beautiful and makes what God chooses to give you more exactly so. Everything in God's good time. There is grace in waiting. It took me my whole life to get here, but I'm here. Late yesterday afternoon at 4, that would be 11 p.m. Manila time, I decided I wanted to stay a little while longer in St. Peter's Square to soak in more of the atmosphere. You get a little attached to it, I have to say. People from many countries milling about, walking around, lining up to get inside the basilica, which we did on our first night here. People taking pictures, looking at the nativity scene, what we know as the Belen, and the giant Christmas tree in the middle of the square. So we decided to record this whole scene for about an hour and 15 minutes. My cameraman, Nino Manalo, squeezed into a time-lapse sequence of 1 minute and 20 seconds. Pay close attention to how the sun slowly sets at past 4, how the lights on the lampposts turn on, how the basilica is illuminated by light, and that when night falls and envelopes roam, how a sight that is magnificent to behold unfolds before your very eyes. Of course, this is an ordinary sight every day at the Vatican, but for us Filipinos, it means something because Pope Francis will pay us a visit next week. In the last few days, there has been much excitement here in the Vatican for the Pope's visit there and to Sri Lanka. And there's been much preparation too, especially for a contingent of 70 journalists who will be flying with Pope Francis to Colombo, Manila, and Tacloban. Journalists, 14 of us Filipinos, 8 of us from 4 networks, including my cameraman and me, and the rest from a broadsheet from 2 Catholic news organizations and Radio Television Malacanang. This is the first time Filipino journalists will be on board a papal flight. On Saturday morning, the Vatican Press Office distributed all our passes to board the papal flights and work programs for the visits, guides for us journalists, and our plane tickets came from a travel agency assigned by the Vatican. Now, earlier, Alan Holdren, EWTN and CNA's bureau chief here in Rome, was invited by Father Greg Gaston to the Colegio Filipino to brief us Filipino journalists about what it's going to be like on the papal plane and what covering the Pope is like on a trip. Holdren has been on 3 papal trips, 2 of them with Benedict XVI and 1 with Pope Francis to South Korea in August. And he'll be coming along this trip to Sri Lanka and the Philippines. For him, it's going to be a very hectic schedule with the Pope, his delegation, and us, the media, jumping from one event to another. Now, Holdren spoke also about this energizer battery of a Pope.
Pope Francis doesn't seem to rest. He just keeps on going. And it's incredible because you'll find that in the moments that you think, you must be resting, you hear later that he was doing something during that. He was baptizing someone, or he was visiting with the Jesuits in that area. He fills what you think are blank spaces with other events. He's always on the move. He must sleep between 4 and 5 hours a night, even while he's here in Rome. And he just keeps on going. It's incredible. I ask myself the same thing with Benedict XVI, because imagine a man of 83, 84 years old who's on a trip seeing different people, giving speeches in his fourth language, trying to put forth the best effort. And it seemed like the energy, I mean, it's a divine mission that these popes are on. You cannot do that job if not for the grace of God. It's impossible. These guys, they need, this is why Pope Francis asks for prayers, I'm convinced, because that's his energy source, it seems. He just keeps on going and going, and you ask yourself, is this physically, humanly possible for a man of his age? And it seems to be. He's been doing it for a year and a half.
There is another veteran Vatican journalist we interviewed who will be going to Manila, although he won't be on the papal flight. And he's coming from the perspective of one who went to Manila with John Paul II in 1995 and one who holds the Philippines close to his heart. Sean Patrick Lovett, the director for English programming of Radio Vaticana, spoke to a number of us Filipino journalists. He makes a great storyteller. We interviewed him on the balcony of Radio Vaticana's building that had as a most beautiful backdrop the Castel d'Angelo, a castle where popes in olden times sought refuge from attackers. The other backdrop of the interview is the picturesque and historic city of Rome. Let's take a listen.
I don't think it's about numbers, actually. It's about quality, not quantity, isn't it? It's about participation. It's about listening to the message, about taking that message to heart, and then living that message. And I think that's what's important. Not how many people were there, but will they be listening? Will they be listening? Will they take his message to heart? Will they put his message into practice? And it's a message of mercy and compassion, which heaven only knows we really need today more than ever.
From here in Rome, can you feel the excitement from the Philippines, the enthusiasm? You know, people are very, very happy.
You're asking the wrong person, because I'm half Filipino. You see, my heart is Filipino. I love the Philippines. I've been there twice in the past year, and one of my best friends is Chito Tagle. So, so you're asking. I feel the enthusiasm. I remember even before we knew the Pope was going, when I was there a year ago, they were hoping the Pope would come in 2016 for the Eucharistic Congress in Cebu. And there was already excitement at the idea that he might come in 2016. So when people understood that he was coming now, I mean, I know. And we Filipinos are very excitable people, aren't we? It doesn't take a lot to get us excited about things. So it's very beautiful. I mean, we're all looking forward to it hugely. After Yolanda, we had a special mass here in the Vatican, in St. Peter's, with the Filipino community here, and Cardinal Tagle was here. They presented a mosaic to the Pope and so forth. And Pope Francis came downstairs, and he had no prepared speech. He just stood there, and again, it's a sign of, he speaks from the heart. This is one of the reasons why people love him so much, because he really speaks with the heart and from the heart. And he stood there, and there were people crying because some had relatives and in Tacloban and Palo, and they felt this very strongly. And he stood there, and all he said was, we must ask God why. He didn't say, these things happen, we must accept it, God loves us, smile, keep smiling. He said we have a right, just like a child. When a child doesn't understand the parent, the child has the right to say, Daddy, why? And we can ask God, why? Why do you allow these to happen? I was crying because it was so powerful. And I think it was there that he got the feeling that he needed to be there. He needed to go there, he needed to experience, to see for himself. And that was when the decision was taken that he would go to Tacloban, he would go to Palo, and he would be close to the people. He would experience together with them. He would show them that mercy and compassion, which is the theme of the visit.
You're going back, right? You're going to be there in Manila also.
Oh yes, I wouldn't miss this for anything, Pia.
Of course, you're happy.
I would swim from here to He's very media friendly, as you know. He always thanks the media. When he became Pope, one of the very first things he did was he held a special audience for the media that had covered his election. And if you go back and you look at that speech or you look at that video, it's beautiful because it's in the Paul VI audience hall, and he sits up there and he starts to giggle. Really? And he looks across at all these thousands of journalists, And he says, you've been working hard, huh? So he knows how hard we work. He understands the challenges of trying to keep up with him, and I know he appreciates it. And one of the signs that he appreciates it is that press conference that he gives on the plane. He will likely give a press conference too, one from Colombo to Manila and one from Manila to Rome. And that's a wonderful opportunity to ask all the questions that need to be asked. And he's so sincere. He doesn't prepare. He really tells you what he feels and what he thinks. And so those press conferences are very useful because they give us an insight. It's not the official speech. It's what he's really thinking and really feeling at that moment. And so it's a very precious moment to get inside his head and his heart. And I know he uses those moments because he understands those messages need to be gotten out. I can tell you a little secret, okay? You're not allowed to tell many people, so shh. Okay? I was in South Korea, in Seoul, yes, and the organization was perfect. It was in perfect South Korean style. And at the Mass for the Martyrs, there were nearly 1 million people there, everybody in silence, in prayer, totally self-controlled, beautiful.
Wow.
Cardinal Tagle was sitting next to me, and he turns to me and he goes, "It's not going to be like this in Manila."
Exactly.
It's not going to be like this.
Is the Pope prepared for that?
And I don't know if he's prepared for that. That's the point. I don't think, are we prepared for that? Do we even know what kind of outpouring there's going? I think it's going to be something fantastic. That's truly, Pia, that's my feeling. My gut feeling is that. Remember that we are in the age of social media as well. 1995, no Facebook, no cell phones, no selfies, no Twitter, no nothing. You were listening, you were following the Mass on the radio. In the age of social media, I mean, we can't predict. I really, it's going to be a surprise, I think, for all of us.
I also spoke to a former journalist who spent 20 years of his career covering the Vatican for Time magazine and then for Fox News. In 2012, about 6 months before Benedict retired, Greg Burke was convinced by the Vatican to join them and work on strategic communications. Greg Burke is senior advisor for communications to the Vatican Secretariat of State. Here's that interview.
Strategic communication, so what your message is, how to get it out. Part of that was what, the social media
social
campaign,
media.
etc.?
I'm particularly involved. I work a lot with News.PH, one of the websites, but I'm on the Twitter team. So I was here, fortunately, when Pope Benedict launched Pontifex, which was already a success under Pope Benedict. And then, of course, under Pope Francis, it's really taken off.
Okay. So it wasn't like, I told you about that article, that described you as, well, practically the guy responsible for for the popularity of Pope Francis, etc.
I want to do a disclaimer from that. That was, let's just say, not the best example of journalism, okay? I mean, it was curious and it was interesting. I think they called me the guru behind the Pope. There is no guru behind the Pope. The Pope is basically his best messenger. We try to help him. We try to help get it out, but basically he has the message and it's his popularity.
Okay. You mentioned 1995, the trip John Paul II took to Manila, right?
Right.
So you were there. Tell us about that. What is it like?
I always call it the Thrilla in Manila, okay? Because it is, according to most people's account, the biggest Mass that John Paul ever celebrated. And of course, he did many big Masses, Mexico, among them, other big Catholic countries. But the Philippines was just overwhelming. The middle of that day was just overwhelming. And I think it left us all in awe, let's say. And so now with Pope Francis coming, who, I don't know, it's hard to measure popularity and we don't know, but we expect certainly very much of the same.
What are your expectations? What do you think is going to happen? How are things going to turn out?
Pope trips in general, I think it's important to remember, Pope trips in general generate a lot of good news. There's enthusiasm, even when they're difficult trips. John Paul had difficult trips, let's say to Northern Europe to Western Europe, the Netherlands. It wasn't a particularly friendly country towards the church. And yet you find out when the trip happens, people of goodwill, a lot of people love the Pope, a lot of other people are just there with goodwill, and they're willing to listen to the Pope. Pope Benedict went to the United Kingdom in very rough times, and yet the trip was a huge success for everybody. If people, once again, people love the Pope, people of goodwill, people willing to listen to the Pope. So trips in general tend to be very good news for the church, for the country, for everybody involved. I think with the Philippines, the lid's going to blow off because obviously it's such a Catholic country. It's got such a strong Catholic community and such an enthusiastic Catholic community. I traveled all over the world for Fox, and every place I went to Mass, what was the biggest population?
Filipino.
Yeah, Filipinos, which was interesting. And so certainly, I mean, that's the big answer. I can get a little more specific.
Yes,
The big
go
answer
ahead.
is we expect huge amounts of enthusiasm, and that's good. But a Pope trip is not about, it's not like a tour of a movie star or rock star, okay? It is, there will be the big crowds, there will be the enthusiasm, there will be all the young people who come out, and yet the way we see a papal trip is essentially, this is a way for the faithful to become closer to Christ. We noticed that on this street, totally packed when John Paul II died.
Yes.
Millions of people coming. Why? Not rock star status. A lot of people personally felt like he had changed their lives. I talked with people when he died. I talked with people when he was made a saint. And what did I hear? I started going to daily Mass. I came back to the church. I became a priest, all because of World Youth Day, because of some connections. I saw him in Chicago. I saw him in New York. I remember him saying this. And that was very moving because you saw people, their lives changed because of the message. And certainly that would be the main thing in a Pope trip, that let Catholics take their faith more seriously, help them get closer to Christ. And that will be the Pope's main message. Now, there are a couple of other things. I mean, obviously, there's a huge call for human dignity. Do we take care of our neighbors? The Pope is always talking about the throwaway culture, old people, the very young, people without work. What am I doing for my neighbor? You know, what am I doing for my neighbor? And then obviously, it's not just Catholics. Philippines is obviously a largely Catholic population, but it is an interreligious thing as well. It's also, okay, anybody of goodwill here to listen to the Pope to get this message of solidarity, of fraternity.
Cardinal Chito Tagle had said that Pope Francis, one of the things Pope Francis told him that the Pope wanted him to tell Filipinos is that let the focus of my trip not be me, but Jesus Christ. Essentially, that's it. Because, I mean, of course, you know, people love him, people, the way they love JP too, no? So there is that feeling sometimes, you know, you're a rock star, and, you know, I really love this Pope, but there is also that very important
It's not about worshiping the Pope, right? It's about falling in love with Jesus Christ. We talked about this during the Twitter account too. It's not how many followers the Pope has. Is this a way to help people follow Jesus Christ? And it's hard, I think, for people to distinguish the two things sometimes, you know, because there is a human element. There's affection. People see the Pope often as they see a loving grandfather. The Pope talks a lot about the church being all-encompassing, a mother whose door is always open. And come back here. Some people talk here about the colonnades being a sort of embrace. The church is open to all. And that's very moving. People feel personal affection, and that's important. And that's good.
But that should be the instrument,
exactly.
Right?
That's not what it's all about. And it may be hard to separate, but it will be good that that's an instrument that leads one. Okay, what is the Pope saying? What is his message for us?
The flight from Rome to Colombo begins with a meet and greet. It is the Pope's way of putting us journalists at ease. On Monday evening, a little over 70 journalists boarded an Alitalia plane bound for Sri Lanka. This is like any flight except that it's papal, and that becomes obvious as soon as we are seated. The headrests carry the papal coat of arms. Alitalia crew hand out luxury brand perfumes and a souvenir program which tells us this chartered flight will fly over Italy, Albania, Greece, Turkey, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and India before reaching Sri Lanka. As is the custom, a telegram of greetings from the Pope, who is head of state of the Vatican, is sent to the heads of state of these countries just as the plane flies over them. We hadn't even been 20 minutes into the flight when Father Federico Lombardi, the Vatican spokesperson, announces that Pope Francis will be coming over to greet the journalists. When the Pope makes an appearance, it causes quite a stir. Father Lombardi begins by saying the flight is unique because there are Filipino journalists on board and that this says something about the expectations in the Philippines. And then Pope Francis talks.
Buonasera. Ne ringrazio la compagnia vostra.
Simple words that match the simple man that he is. Francis thanks the journalists for the company, says there is a lot of work, and says that he will greet each one personally. Many of the Vatican correspondents and international journalists on the flight have already met the Pope or are friends with him. But for the 14 Filipinos on board, it was our first time to meet him. As television journalists, we prepare what we call spiels for what we're going to say in front of the camera. But sometimes people like Pope Francis can just leave you speechless. It's happened to many others who've met him. They prepare and memorize what they'll say when they're going to come face to face with Francis. And then when he's there, everything becomes a blur. So the next best thing is to ask him to bless the 36 rosaries bought earlier in the day at St. Peter's. He obliges, puts both hands on the rosaries, bows his head, and closes his eyes. Francis is never known to say no, and he's known to listen to what you say. My seatmates, the other Filipino journalists, had their own moments with the Pope, that by the time he had finished greeting all the journalists, quite a number were in tears. The encounter was far from perfect. One thinks that one could have said something better to the Pope or thought of something better to ask him to do. But a moment is worth what it was, not what it could have been. That moment was priceless, and there is the possibility of many more. Catholics are a minority in Sri Lanka, but the welcome for the Pope at the Colombo airport is as warm as it could be anywhere else in the world. Children are singing, and 14 elephants from Buddhist temples are all dressed up to welcome Francis. It was quite a sight to behold. A motorcade through the streets of Colombo lasted 2 hours, and that meant Pope Francis was under the sun for that long that he had to cancel a meeting with Sri Lankan bishops. But Francis did everything else on his schedule, like canonize Sri Lanka's first saint, Joseph Vaz. Blessed Joseph Vaz is now Saint Joseph Vaz, an Indian priest who came to Sri Lanka in 1687 when it was still called Ceylon. Vaz labored for years to rebuild the Catholic Church in the midst of religious persecution. Vaz was beatified by John Paul II when he was here in January 1995. 20 years later, Francis travels to this distant land to make Vaz a saint. The Mass didn't start on time as the Pope went through the crowds on his Pope Mobile and blessed several people in wheelchairs. A canonization Mass begins with the rite of canonization, first a litany of saints and then a formula of canonization, which is read in Latin and enrolls him among the saints and decrees that he is to be venerated as such by the whole Church.
Beatum Iosephum Vas, Sanctum esse decerimus et definimus, ac Sanctorum catalogo ascribimus, statuentis eo in universa Ecclesia, inter Sancto Pia Devotionis Recoli Devere, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
As the Mass ended, Sri Lankan Cardinal Malcolm Ranjith presented the Pope with a gift, a $70,000 contribution to the Pope's charities. St. Joseph Vaz joins the ranks of Asian saints, among them Lorenzo Ruiz and Pedro Calungsod, whose canonizations were witnessed by thousands of Filipinos, as was Joseph Vaz's canonization today. There are quite a few Filipinos at the Mass, some who live and work here and are married to Sri Lankans, and some who traveled from the Philippines just to get a glimpse of Pope Francis.
Yeah, parang malapitan. Makikita namin ang malapitan. At least dito talagang malapit kami. Pag sa Pilipinas, naku po, ang layo.
Just a few days, I came here, just to see the Pope.
Nagpapasalamat po kami dahil kahit po hindi po kami makaka-uwi mo ng Pilipinas, ay nandito po kami para makita po namin siya.
We want to see a Pope, and this is the holy and the blessed for us to attend this kind of ceremony.
As the Pope's visit to Sri Lanka winds down and Manila prepares to welcome him, one can't help but ask, what's it going to be like in Manila? This gathering of about 500,000 Sri Lankans here in Colombo is almost like a dress rehearsal, a dry run, a preview, a sneak peek of what's going to happen in the Philippines. So for those of you counting down to the arrival of Pope Francis in the Philippines, well, there's just 36 more hours to go. Francis did what he came to do in Sri Lanka, meet with other religious leaders, including Buddhist monks, and pay a visit to the shrine of Our Lady of Madhu, the two things that John Paul II couldn't do when he was there 20 years ago. But Francis did more than that. He made up for the cancelled meeting with bishops and went to a Buddhist temple. On that last night in Colombo, Father Lombardi, the Vatican spokesman, was asked about the bad weather waiting for us in the Philippines, and he said, if it's just rain, the Pope is not afraid of rain. We couldn't wait to get home to Manila. In-flight entertainment is a staple on board any flight, but the papal flights, at least for the papacy of Francis, has a built-in, never-before-seen feature, the press conference, such as the one he gave on the flight from Colombo to Manila. After all, no one does it like Pope Francis. A good friend of his and a veteran Vatican radio journalist, Sean Patrick Lovett, had told us back in Rome that the Pope holds press conferences because this is one way he shows journalists that he appreciates the work we do and he knows how difficult it can be. As is the practice, we, the 70 Vatican journalists, get off the plane before Pope Francis does, and the sights and sounds of the welcome at Villamor Air Base and on the streets leading to the papal nunciature are beyond overwhelming. The next day, the welcome is still as warm as it was, whether it was in Malacanang, at the Manila Cathedral, or at the Mall of Asia Arena. But Francis is Francis, and he does what he always does, whether he is home in the Vatican or on a trip. He will surprise us all by doing what is not on his schedule, such as a visit to poor children right after he celebrates Mass at the Manila Cathedral, or an audience with some 40 Jesuits at the Nunciature after an audience with families at the Mall of Asia. As we flew out of Manila and into Tacloban on Saturday, January 17, you could imagine the Pope thinking that he needed to be there. You could almost feel his willpower pushing the plane forward and steering us through the turbulence and the wind and the rain. And with good reason. Francis had made a promise to be with those who suffered at the hands of a storm so powerful that nothing like it had ever been recorded. He made good on that promise because there is no message more powerful than his presence. Tacloban and Palo were moving. The way people stood in the rain, wind and cold, shivering and wet, but waiting, just waiting for Francis. And the way the joy shone on their faces when he was finally among them. Then again, how do you describe that which is indescribable? As we flew through turbulence, through wind and rain, through a tropical storm,
I could almost imagine Pope Francis thinking that he needed to be here in Tacloban to be with the people of Leyte and Samar, those who lived through but barely survived Yolanda. As a father would wade through floodwaters or battle the winds to rescue his children, to be with them, perhaps that was why the Pope decided he needed to be here. This pastoral visit he makes to the Philippines was really for the victims of Haiyan or Yolanda. And now today, as we flew in from Manila, a tropical storm had threatened to derail his promise to be here. But the Pope's promise to be here has been kept, and he's here with them. The Mass is being celebrated in English, but most of it, the songs, many of the responses, some of the readings are in the local dialect, Waray. The Pope himself preferred to speak in Spanish. For most of the Vatican-accredited journalists on the flight with the Pope, most, if not all of them, or all of us, don't understand Waray, neither does the Pope and his party. But you see, there is one language we can understand, a universal language that we call love, mercy, and compassion, of empathy, of being with someone in the most difficult moments of that person's life, and to just be with them, even as Pope Francis said, I don't know what to say, and simply offered his silence. The Pope is here. He made good on his word as a father to his children in the face of a tropical storm named of all things Amang, which means father. You can all see the sea of humanity behind me. It is unbelievable. How do you describe that which is indescribable?
Now, when the Pope announced he was leaving Tacloban earlier than planned, the crowd inside the Paulo Cathedral was clearly saddened. Pia Hontiveros, the chief correspondent for our affiliate there at 9 TV, has been traveling with the Pope, and she joins us now live from Manila. Pia, give us a sense. I know you've been traveling with the Pope, that you've been on the airplane with him. Give us a sense of the emotion that people are feeling now with this visit.
Well, Paula, maybe we can begin with this. What the people in Tacloban and Palo looked like while they were waiting for the Pope to get near them. You know what kids look like when they're waiting for their parents to pick them up after a long day at school or after several days, when they've been waiting for their parents, to see their parents. You know, all these people in Tacloban and Palo standing in the rain, in the cold, and in the wind, just waiting for Pope Francis, not moving at all, just waiting for him. They just needed to see him. And then the joy on their faces, the happiness on their faces when he finally arrived, when he was with them, when he was touching them, when he was among them, when he was amongst them, when he was saying the Mass. So it's almost like, how do you describe the indescribable? The crowds were electric. The minute they saw Pope Francis, all the cheering, all the applause, some of them in tears. All they needed to do was see him, and they'd end up crying.
Yeah, Pia, you say it's difficult to describe. You did an excellent job there. I still have that image in my head of these people waiting as if to see, you know, that kind of parental guidance and influence. I mean, they're deeply spiritual people. They've been through so much. How palpable, how disappointing was it that he wasn't able to stay for the entire time scheduled?
Well, of course, they were very, very disappointed. It was supposed to be an 8-hour day, 8-hour plus day in Tacloban and Palo, which was ground zero for Haiyan. But it was almost like, you know, if they could hold on to him and keep him from boarding the plane, they would do that. But of course, they had to go. Earlier, you mentioned how disappointed the religious, the priests and nuns were in the Palo Cathedral. When the Pope said, "I have to go," you know, they let out a collective, "Oh," something like that. It was all they could do to keep from stopping him from leaving the cathedral. But of course, you know, the Pope didn't want to disappoint either. So early on, the Pope said that as much as possible, I would like to do everything I need to do here in Palo and in Tacloban, and not disappoint people as much as possible. Paula?
Pia, and we're watching now images of the Pope in his yellow poncho. It was raining. He was wearing the same poncho that everyone in the crowd was. I mean, we're now looking forward to his visit in Manila. Up to 6 million people expected. Pia, give us a sense of what it means to the Philippines, to the entire country, what it means to have the Pope there right now.
I'd have to say, Paul, it means the world to us right now. You have Pope Francis, the Vicar of Christ,
the leader of the Roman Catholic Church. This is a Roman Catholic country, majority, almost 90, more than 90% Roman Catholic. This means a lot to us, and even to other religions in this country. It's a very, very big thing, and I'm sure you can see that. All the video that's been fed there, you can see how people, even here in Manila, are coming out in the streets, and that was just day one. That was just the day of his arrival. And yesterday, today, the way they're coming out into the streets in droves and waiting just to see him, just to get a glimpse of him, just to take photos of him and cheer. And some of them, like I said, in Tacloban, Palo, here in Manila, they all just end up in tears. And you know, the message that he brings, it's not just I'm here, as he said in the Mass, his presence itself, that's the very clear message. No other stronger message than that, his presence here in the Philippines.
Okay, Pia, we know we continue to follow it. Look forward to reports from the Philippines in the next day or so. Thanks so much.
Those who would like to receive Holy
We
Communion.
needed to take off at 1 o'clock p.m. We took off at 4 minutes past the deadline the pilots gave. Picture the storm closing in on the tail of the plane, and your imagination would run wild. Mine did. January 18, Sunday, was the Pope's last full day in Manila, and we made it worth all it was. From the meeting with the youth in the University of Santo Tomas, to the Mass at the Luneta. What else is there to say about the record crowds that came out to greet Pope Francis that hasn't already been said? John Allen Jr. is a leading Vatican journalist. On that last night in Manila, we felt it would be best to talk to him to wrap things up for us. First, a general question about how you felt about the whole thing.
Well, look, Pia, I mean, you and I have talked before. I believe the Philippines are the greatest home court advantage for a pope anywhere on the planet. I mean, I don't care who the pope is, and I don't care what the circumstances are. If he comes to this place, the enthusiasm is going to be off the hook. And so, to some extent, it was written in the stars. This was going to be a successful trip. But that said, I do think Pope Francis brought something special to this. I think Pope Francis has a great genius for reading the emotions of a situation and knowing, not as a politician or a statesman, but as a pastor, how to respond to what people need from him. I think we saw that from him in Tacloban on Saturday, when he just utterly, tossed his prepared speech aside and launched into a deeply personal, heartfelt meditation. At the end, basically said, having witnessed the suffering, I'm reduced to silence, and so I will accompany you in silence. And of course, his top note was simply, I'm here. Right, and at the end of the day, I think that's the message those people needed to hear. Yeah. We saw it at UST Sunday morning when he set through the testimonies of the three young people, and particularly those two young people at the beginning, the boy and the girl, who had talked about their experience.
Former street children, yeah.
Former street children. And the girl, of course, tears up. I mean, can't even get through the question that she wants to ask because she's so overcome by emotion. And once again, you see the Holy Father saying, I need to respond to that, and I need to engage that, and I need to do it in a personal way. I mean, I've written before that Francis is the world's parish priest. I mean, he's a guy that you feel like could be the pastor at the church down the corner, next to the drugstore and the coffee shop. It's just that he happens to be Pope. And I think you've seen that play out on this trip in an extraordinarily successful way.
What do you think of Cardinal Tagle, how he did during this trip?
Well, I mean, first of all, I've been accused of being Cardinal Tagle's campaign manager. I mean, I described him several months ago as the Asian Francis. And so I may not be the most unbiased observer because I'm a big fan. But look, I think there are probably three parties whose stock was already high and is now even higher as a result of this trip. Okay, there's Pope Francis. There's the Philippines, and then there's Cardinal Tagle. I think he may be a new contender for the title of best host of a papal trip we've ever seen. Because it's not just that things went well and all of that, but if you look at the talks that Cardinal Tagle gave, he wasn't just phoning it in. I mean, these were inspired talks. If you look at the briefings he gave to the media, I mean, they were deeply emotional at times, they were witty at times, but it was all real, and it was all compelling. And if you look at that final talk he gave to the Holy Father on Sunday at the Mass at Luneta, there was that moment when he turned to the crowd at the end and he asked them to repeat certain phrases.
Yes.
I mean, it was clear that crowd was with him.
Right.
Okay, when he speaks, he doesn't just speak as Cardinal so-and-so, but he can credibly claim to be the face and the voice of the church in the Philippines. So yeah, I think he turned in an extremely impressive performance. I already think that in Catholic circles, people were already very impressed with him. I think they will be even more so after this trip.
Yeah, okay. Final words, anything else you want to add? And let's bring the focus back to Pope Francis and the trip.
Well, Pope Francis, I think in his remarks today, talked about the pivotal leadership role that the Philippines play for Catholicism, for the faith in Asia. I frankly think, you could have taken the "in Asia" out of that sentence and just stopped with the pivotal leadership role that Filipino Catholics play, period. Because the truth of it is, in a staggering number of places of the world, the most passionate and the most dynamic pockets of the local church in those places is composed of Filipinos. The Pope came here not merely to sort of give a thumbs up, okay, but also to deliver a challenge, and that is that increasingly in the 21st century, the Catholic Church depends, and every day it depends a little bit more on the church in the Philippines. And so I guess the final message here ought to be that if you really want to do something for the Holy Father, it's not just show up at Luneta Park. It's also take that challenge onto your shoulders and live up to it.
How do you describe a send-off where everyone, as is the traditional Pinoy hatid to the airport, sees him off, when everyone didn't want to send off the Pope? I think it would be apt to say that if we could have held on to him and kept him from boarding the plane, we would have. And perhaps, maybe even, as Jim Paredes said on Twitter, hope that Pope Francis would misplace his boarding pass. We would, wouldn't we? But of course we had to let him go and let him get on that flight back to Rome.
This Philippine Airlines Airbus 4-engine 340 flew Pope Francis home to Rome. And in spite of the fact that he is Pope, Francis does the most human of things on board. Hold a press conference, meeting with Filipino journalists and the pilots and crew of the plane, eats, rests, prays, and goes to the comfort room. 2 captains, 2 second officers, 11 crew members, and 2 flight mechanics made up the complement of this papal flight. Captain Manuel Ski Tamayo was in command of the aircraft. He also flew the Pope to and from Tacloban. With him was Captain Eric Isaac, second officers Anthony Atendido and John Marlo Valencia. Flight purser Janet Perez and Francis Aduza, Yancy Sarza, Ruby Manzano, Evangeline Resho, Mike Macaraeg, Jan Mark Lontazar, Rowena Clemente, Jacqueline Burgos, Aris Obeso, and Pinky Reyes. 3 of them, Perez, Aduza, and Sarza, were assigned to the business class section where the Pope was seated for the entire flight. Movement in that section was limited.
When we talked to the Pope, I just asked the Pope to bless me with my family, and I also thanked him for visiting the Philippines.
Diba, an experience that, well, some of us will never, ever, ever, ever have. So ako personally, I feel very, very blessed to be a part of this.
Well, it feels so different because he's very simple and he's like a very regular guy.
Konti lang yung words, but the feeling was really, I can't explain it eh. Parang speechless na ako, and at the same time, I'm so overwhelmed by his presence.
Since yesterday, we've been crying, and I couldn't help but just really shed it here, being so overwhelmed with joy and happiness.
2 flight safety officers from the 250th Presidential Airlift Wing were also on board. They ensured safety on all levels. In the critical phases of the flight, particularly takeoff and landing, maintenance and technical checks, running test flights, their pilots are on board the aircraft's last revenue flight to ensure airworthiness. The aircraft is also secured inside and outside at all times. The objective, to deliver the VVIP, the very, very important person, Pope Francis, safely to Rome.
This is this aircraft's maintenance servicing report. It's dated January 17. Everything checks out A-OK. And this is this aircraft history and pre-flight inspection checklist: engines, exhaust ducts, auxiliary power unit, brakes, tires, pilot tube, comfort room, instrumentation, air conditioner, seat and cover, fire extinguisher, doors and windows, flight control services, fuel test, and avionic. Everything checks out, also A-OK.
As is the airline's tradition, the crew sets aside anything and everything the Pope uses on board: headrest, seat cover, tray, utensils, blankets, pillows. The crew says they're considered relics. Everything the VVIP eats is under lock and key. There is no special menu for the flight. The Pope gave instructions that he should be served what everyone else is served. Maybe that's why we're served business class food too. And it turns out Pope Francis seemed to like this orange drink very much, that the crew wisely set aside a supply for him just in case he asked for more. Shepherd 1 may have been a papal flight, but on board was very human and very precious cargo.
There's never been this big a media delegation from a country such as the 14 Filipino journalists who were part of the Vatican-accredited media personnel, or VAMP, who traveled with Pope Francis from Rome to Sri Lanka to the Philippines and back to Rome. And because it was our first time on the papal flight, a surprise awaited us on board the flight from Manila to Rome. A second chance to meet the Pope in brief but private individual audiences. This is my account as Vatican-accredited media personnel, or VAMP journalist number 46.
The Pope always does two things on the plane: hold a press conference and meet the journalists. As soon as the press conference ended, Father Federico Lombardi brought us, the 14 Filipino journalists, to the business section of the plane where Pope Francis sat. Lombardi said we would each get to sit with Pope Francis for a few moments and have our pictures taken with him by the official Vatican photographer. I didn't want to take up too much of his time, so I just showed him a recent family photo: my husband and me and our 4 kids. I asked if I could embrace him and told him I would always pray for him. Embracing Francis is like putting your arms around a soft stuffed toy, cotton candy, or even a cloud. It was joy. He makes you feel that nothing is going to harm you, that your worries are over. He gave all of us that feeling when he visited Manila, Tacloban, and Palo. He was there for and with each and every one of us. Remember what he said in Tacloban? I'm here.
Cuando yo vi desde Roma esta catástrofe,
When I saw from Rome that catastrophe,
sentí que tenía que estar aquí.
I felt that I had to be here.
Y ese día, esos días, decidí hacer el viaje aquí.
And on those very days, I decided to come here.
Quise venir para estar con ustedes.
I'm here to be with you.
Un poco tarde, me dirán, es verdad.
A little bit late, I have to say,
pero estoy.
but I'm here.
There is no message more powerful than his presence. I spoke to some of my colleagues and asked them what it is they said to or asked Pope Francis, how it made them feel, and what it meant to them.
So I just asked for 2 things. Number 1, to bless the rosaries that I have for my friends and relatives. And number 2, to pray for sick people.
While approaching him, I was quite, afraid, somewhat nervous. But when I was with him, it was peaceful.
The first pa lang na when I said that I'm from Tacloban, where Hayan, parang gumano na siya. So, sabi ko parang he's sad.
Hindi ka nang umiyak.
Yeah, I don't know, parang pagtayo ka, nanginginig ako, papablik sa upuan. I think until now.
Ayun, medyo teary-eyed nung pinipigilan ko lang yung pag-iyak.
Now, nag-sink in po sa akin kung ano yung messaging niyang gustong ipaabot sa akin. Na ako lang ang nasa kaloob-looban ko lang, nasa aking isipan, na nasagot na niya na personal.
Right after that audience, Father Lombardi gave all the journalists gifts from the Pope, a rosary, a stampita, a photograph of the Pope and his coat of arms behind it, and medallions, mementos of his visit to Sri Lanka, a medallion of Our Lady of Madu, and for the Philippines, a medallion of the Santo Niño. So how do you end a story like this? I don't know. I don't want it to end. And you know, so do you.
This was not just a story, neither was this just a coverage, at least for the 14 Filipino journalists who had the honor to be the first on board the papal flights. It was a blessing, it was a gift, it was grace. It was a wing on a prayer, it was a pilgrimage, it was a road to Damascus, it was a window to our souls, it was an answer to a question that had no answer for so long. It was proof that God's plans are not ours. Proof that everything in God's good time. Proof that he gives you what you yearn for if or when you are ready for it. Proof that what burns you prepares you. Proof that Advent is any season in our life when God prepares us for what he chooses to give us. Proof that there is grace in waiting. 9 flights, 3 datelines, 1 Pope. Grazie, Papa Francesco. Your visit meant everything to us. Thank you for watching. See you again next Wednesday. I'm Pia Hontiveros. Good night.